Hi, I'm Phil Long, Precision Agronomy Advisor for Latham High-Tech Seeds. And today we're going to be talking about something that we get asked quite a bit, but don't cover all the time, and that's placing products using our product guide and the characteristics within the product guide. So I'm going to be talking about how different hybrids handle stress and ear flex and so forth, but I want to relate it back to the product guide and how we can use some of these characteristics and qualities in our hybrids to make sure that we're placing products correctly. Because we know from lots of years of research that 20% of our yield right off the top comes from placing products on the right acre, on the right field every time. So if you're missing the boat on that, whether it's on your farm or a customer's farm, you're losing that 20%. And that's why a lot of times you'll see swings of 20 to 50 bushel in different hybrids, because one wasn't placed on the right field or acre. It's not because it's not a good hybrid, it's just because it wasn't placed where it should have been. So we're going to talk about all those things, and we're going to talk about them how I enjoy talking about it the most, and that's G by E by M. So genetics by environment by management. So if you get all the stars to align, put the right genetics in the right field and have the weather and everything cooperate, and then do your part on the management side, you'll definitely see the maximum yield that you can possibly get for that field. So let's jump right into it. I want to start with the genetics side, and typically when you place hybrids, the way to narrow it down obviously is by talking about the maturity. So if they have a maturity range that they want to stay within, or you're looking to stay within, that helps narrow down the hybrids. And then the next thing I usually ask is what's your rotation? So if you're corn on corn, if you're corn soybeans, obviously that makes a difference whether you're going to do smart stacks versus double pro or a roundup or a conventional hybrid. So that really helps narrow it down. And then the next thing that I always ask is probably the one question that farmers enjoy answering the most, and that's what's the background of this field. So by that I mean soil type, what are some of the history of it, what's the yield limiting factors in the soil types. And typically if a farmer has 30 or 40 years experience farming in that particular field, they have a big answer for this question, and that's good. And that's where it really helps out with placing a product. If you know that field like the back of your hand, you can really place it best. So the best place to start after you kind of narrow things down with maturity and traits and so forth, the package, the major package anyway, you go straight to the placement charts. And this year we put them right there in that whole table, right beside everything else, which is really handy. So you can start with that and you can understand, okay, does this hybrid do good on stress soils? Does it do better on maybe an in-between or a more variable soil, or does it need to stay on those better fertility type soils? A lot of times, another thing I want to touch on is when you're looking at that highly productive area and you see ones in that, and maybe it doesn't do so well in the stressed or the moderate average productivity soils, and then you see, for example, in this one you see things that say top end yields under high management. So those kind of wordings are key information to pay attention to when you're looking at products. If a particular farmer or you yourself, maybe if you don't do things like in-season fungicide, or maybe the fertility level, you don't know how well the fertility is in that field, those are not products to put on that particular field. If it says things like that, it really wants the best of the best so that it can build a factory out there and build the best ear and the best yield that it can. So just remember that as you're going through it. So the next thing that I look to, we've already talked about maturity and placement. And so the agronomics and the disease traits or qualities in those plants, I really focus on next. So if you've got a history in that field, still focusing on the field and the history in that field. If you've got a history of, say, things like gray leaf spot or northern corn leaf blight or white mold in soybeans or whatever the case may be, if you know that history, you can plan around it. So now that we're getting into some of those, the agronomics and the disease traits in the plant, I want to point out one important thing, and that's the rating scale. So it's a 1 to 5, 1 being excellent or outstanding, however you want to look at it, 5 being poor. You're not going to see any 5s in there. We don't pick hybrids or varieties that are poor in anything, but you will see some 3s, and that simply means average. So if you see a 3 or a 2.5 or something like that, that doesn't mean it's bad. That just means it's average, or maybe slightly above average, or whatever the case may be. But just remember that 3 is your average as you go on up the scale. So when I look at those and I see things like a 2.5 on gray leaf spot or northern cornleaf blight, I wouldn't shy away from that. If that particular product fits the soil and fits the management style of that farmer, don't shy away from those things. You know, ask them if they're willing to put a fungicide on, or if they do side dress nitrogen or things like that that really help protect the plant and give it an extra boost throughout the season. So remember, G by E by M, you know, the management obviously interacts with the rest of the piece. So we got to have it all together to get our maximum yield. So if you can alter some of those things, even if it's not the top trait or top quality on a particular hybrid, but everything else fits the bill, then don't shy away from it. So the other stuff I want to touch on here is the agronomics and the plant characteristics. Plant characteristics tend to get overlooked, and those are simply plant height, and ear type. So the plant height has a lot to do with when we talk about those stressy type soils and things like that. When you have corn is a little bit different than soybeans when we talk about this, but the plant height itself plays a major role in that. How big a factory is going to be out there? So we have hybrids like 5742. That's kind of a monster in terms of bringing a tall plant to the field and a lot of potential to put a lot of kernels on and a big ear. That's not the kind of hybrid that you necessarily want to place in a really stressy situation. So as we get into these here, I do have a couple examples, and the one on laying on my tailgate is 5025, which is a drought guard. We've got a couple drought guard hybrids, but the drought guard hybrids typically, even 5020, that's not drought guard with the trait, but still has good characteristics to battle against stress type situations, is going to have a medium stature plant. So that simply means it's a maybe not the tallest hybrid out in the lineup, but it's going to do better under the stressful situations. It's not as big of a plant, so it's not going to use as much water and nitrogen as it's going through those tough periods, and that's how it's being more efficient with those things as it's utilizing them throughout the season. So ear height, that can be very important too, especially depending on the farmer, or harvesting characteristics and what you like to see, or maybe wind scenarios and things like that. You may not want one that places an ear really high. If you have maybe on the top of a hill or whatever the situation may be, you can look at those ear height characteristics and help determine which hybrid to place for that. So ear type, I'm going to talk about that here quite a bit. But the ear type, semi-flex, semi-determinate, those are two of probably the most common that you see in our product guide. The scale for that, as we've talked before, goes from full flex to full determinate. So there's not really any full flexes that we have. We used to have one. There's just not many out there because the risk is really large. So if you have a full flex hybrid, 5025, like I was talking about earlier, is a semi-flex. If we had a full flex hybrid and we put it in a stressful situation, and then we put too much population to it, you would see much worse than even this small ear here, which was at about 55,000 plants per acre. So if you have everything builds up and you don't get the right moisture and so forth, and you have a full flex hybrid, it can really take a nosedive. So just remember, full flex or semi-flex is going to flex in more ways. So you flex in girth, rows around, the length, kernels long, and then obviously the ear or the kernel depth as well. So don't forget 3 different ways to flex. So a full flex can potentially lose yield, the way I think about it, potentially go down in all 3, versus a full determinate on the other side of the scale, like 5517, which, as you can see in this case, 24 to 40,000. It doesn't give up much all the way across, and that's where you lose yield at the low populations if you're not putting enough population to it. Genetically, it wants to stay at a certain size ear, so it's a more determinate ear type and is going to maintain that ear even as you go on up into higher populations. So as we talk about that though, and talk about the management side, I just like to keep stressing that when you see those things that it likes to have high fertility and so forth, those are huge players when it comes to getting optimal yields. And when you're placing products like this that require maybe in-season shot of nitrogen or something like that, and a fungicide, you got to protect those plants, and you got to care for them all season long to get that optimal yield. So as we move on down the line, one of the other things I want to talk about is a couple of these agronomic characteristics that we haven't touched on that much yet. So we went through maturity. I do want to mention the flowering for maturity. Sometimes that gets overlooked or maybe misunderstood. So flowering for maturity is just going to simply compare that hybrid to that average maturity range and how it comes into flowering compared to that particular RM or days to black layer. So we got ME on this one, so that's medium early, equal. Sometimes you'll see medium late and things like that. Just give you an indication of how it comes into flowering. So if it's like in this case we have 50-25, that's going to be a medium early. A lot of the more stress tolerant plants are going to be medium early because they want to line up that window. So they're going to flower earlier to try and avoid some of that stress that comes on later in the season. Obviously we typically have less water later in the season, and that just really helps line up the silks coming out in case the pollen gets pushed ahead by the hot weather and so forth. You have a better alignment of that, so you got less pollination issues. So as you look on through the agronomic characteristics, this really focuses in on the second part of the equation, which when I'm talking to a farmer asking about their management style, everybody manages a little bit different, and everybody has their own reasons for doing certain things. You may wait till the ideal time to plant. You may plant as early as you can get in the field. Whatever the case may be, that's what some of this stuff relates to. So looking at the first one there, emergence and early vigor, we talked about the rating scale, so you understand what the 2s and the 3s and so forth mean. So those really give us an indication of, is this something that you should be planting early? If it's sitting at a 3 on emergence and a 3 on early vigor, let's say, that's not one you want to recommend that they plant first. So if you're delivering that one, deliver it and put it in the back of the shed so that they're not tempted to plant that first as they grab their seed out of the shed. But those two really relate to early planting, how early they want to get out there, and if they're planting everything early or trying to, then focus on those hybrids that have good scores for emergence and early vigor out of the ground, because obviously you want the plant to have a good healthy start, give it everything it's got. If you're putting on stuff with a planter and stuff, nutrients and so forth, that helps as well. But just protecting it early on is important. But the genetics do, depending on the hybrid, have limitations on that. So some of the other ones as you go on down the line, stalk strength, root strength, that really helps us understand, once again, going back to management style. This is one in a lot of calls I go on and see relates to the fertility of that particular farm. If you know the fertility, great. Plan a hybrid accordingly to that fertility, because fertility has a huge role in how a plant stands all season long, even green snap qualities and things like that, but especially late season stalk integrity, plant health, things like that. If you've got the nitrogen, you've got the major nutrients and the other ones in there as well, it's going to stand a lot longer. If you've got things out of whack, then unfortunately you're going to see issues with lodging and so forth late season, or if we have issues like this particular year with drought and so forth, we could have certain hybrids that want to steal some of those out of the stalk as they're not able to take up as much from the ground. So just remember, all those things come into play when you're looking at how a particular farmer manages their fields. A lot of these other ones in here, dry down and so forth, is extremely important for a lot of farmers. Depends on their style again. Do they want to get in there early? Do they want to, are they worried about it drying down in the field? Do they not care? Things like that. If they want it to be 16-17%, then that dry down is really important. Test weight also. Then we have drought tolerance. We've talked quite a bit about that, and fungicide characteristics. Obviously, the wordings that I've mentioned should also key into those things if it's recommended or not. But those ones that say that they want that upper management, you want to make sure that you're giving it to it, and if it matches up with, like we always talk about, when we get into late season, we haven't seen a lot of diseases this year. Certain parts have more than others. I know northern cornleaf blight and gray leaf spot and so forth, but just not a ton of disease pressure. So, but make sure to pay attention to those characteristics. If you're seeing a 3 or a 2.5 on things like gray leaf spot and northern, then you need to protect it with a fungicide if you're wanting that top end yield potential. So herbicide sensitivity. is also good. You don't want to put a herbicide on post-emergence and have issues with malformed ears and things like that. So pay attention to that if there is a particular hybrid that may have a certain sensitivity to a certain class of or group of herbicides. And then finally, suggested plant populations. We also have tech sheets and so forth that cover this information even to a greater extent, but this really encompasses everything as you put it together. So whether you're going to suggest somebody plants 32,000 or 36,000, obviously I grabbed 50-25 here, if I can grab the ears, 50-25 out of the field, and I've got them a little mixed up here, it looks like. But you can see, if you compare this particular hybrid to 55-17 and how it flexes throughout the population. So roughly 25,000 on up to 40,000 here with 50-25. So semi-flex, it's going to flex more. The more it's stressed, it's going to reduce the amount that goes into the ear. And if it's even more stressed, like I mentioned before, I've seen a lot of fields where you can end up with really small ears. So just remember, semi-flex ears are going to flex down in all three ways. So you got to be careful if you're placing those products. Typically you don't need to push a population on those, so 32, 34 would be just fine for most of those as a generalization, but obviously that suggested plant population gives you a better understanding. 55-17 here that I've got for the rest of this, 24 to 40,000, you can also see. But like I mentioned before, a semi-determinate ear, it's amazing how well they hold, and each one does it a little different. We've got 56-35 and 57-39 that hold the girth really well. They always want to have a big, really fat, girthy ear. 55-17 likes to hold its length, you can tell, 24 to 40,000. It's pretty amazing. But if you do get into looking at it a little bit closer as it gets up to that higher population, you notice that it does lose some kernel depth at the 40,000 population versus the lower population. So all those things come into play. We're not quite done filling the ear yet either, so there's still a little bit of room there to finish out and get some more test weight and finish filling out those kernels. So just remember, all these things come into play when you're putting together a package or placing a product on your own farm or a customer's farm. Take a look at all this information that's in the book, and then ask any of us to clarify if you need help. There's a guide at the very front here. I didn't mention the first start of the corn pages. You'll see the information on the different Double Pro Smart Stacks and what insect protection they have, as well as what these ratings and so forth mean. So just remember, this is a great resource, as well as our tech sheets online that you have at your disposal to really place that product to get that extra 20%. So thanks for spending time with me today, and good luck on the rest of the season.